So much. I'm going to come and stand over here. I was really enjoying that debate, so hopefully we'll get through this as quickly as possible and then we can carry on with those really important discussions. Yes, slightly provocative line for this evening. I have to confess I'm not a data manager. I did, in my previous job, work at the National Data Standards Organisation for Museums, so I've had lots of hard data problems around time and space and where things come from. But you have a great deal more knowledge in data management than I do. So I thought what would be useful is to talk about this question of where we're actually at in terms of the role of information in our lives and what the best means of protecting ourselves actually look like. To those of you that don't know us, I did try and find a picture list with you in it, but I didn't manage to find one. We are the UK's Information Professional Association. Our aim is to bring together people working in knowledge, information, data and libraries. But the thing that sort of gets me out of bed in the morning is this belief that we are living and working in the early days of an age that is already and will come to be defined by knowledge, information, data, and the skills and ethics to use them productively for social and economic good. So my view on fake news, which I'll touch on in a bit, is that it's actually about something very old. It's about good faith. And it's about whether people share news with good faith or whether they share it with malicious intent, and that's slightly what I'd like to talk about here. So to look at the world that we are increasingly going into as CILIP, we work with information professionals, much like engineers. You can be a mechanical engineer or an electronics engineer, you can specialise in signals processing. We have information professionals working in libraries, those places that are changing every day. We have people working in the corporate sector, particularly around knowledge and information management. So we're doing a big piece of work at the moment with KPMG on a report called Information as an Asset, to look at how big corporates are valuing their strategic information assets. And then a whole world of people that we're starting to talk to who I don't fully understand what they do. I met a data lake manager recently. That was an entirely new experience for me, so I'm sure many of you will know data lake managers. But very interesting this evening. I'm really grateful to Julian and colleagues for inviting me here, because I think there is so much that we now have in common as communities, that there is a really important conversation here between BCS and CILIP about these areas around ethics and information. We've run a campaign, we actually launched it in time for the snap general election in 2017, called Facts Matter, which was looking at the role of evidence and accountability in information, particularly around the democratic process, with the wonderful Jimmy Wales. I should say, as well as having worked in sort of museum data before, I'm also a trustee of Wikimedia UK with a particular interest in DBpedia and the structuring of data around the kind of open knowledge movement. So that's something we might talk about later on. But where this came from was a think tank session I went to, I can't actually name the think tank, which brought together people from different environments to talk about exactly this issue. And there was a senior security official there who said this, and I thought this was fascinating and troubling. The internet has brought so much good in terms of boundless, permissionless innovation, but at the same time our current approach means that we are sending our children naked into the battlefield in an information war. That every day we are sending our kids out into an untrammeled digital space, the wonderful open web that's been with us for 30, 40 years, without the equipment, the armour that they need to use that space safely and productively. So I thought, well, that's interesting. Information warfare, that was a new, kind of whole new thing to be worried about for me. So I went away and kind of decided to do a little bit of work finding out what it means. And there's this fascinating World Economic Forum briefing from Professor David Stupples in 2015. Information warfare is the integration of electronic warfare, so using electronic countermeasures, jamming signals, all of that. Cyber warfare in terms of incursions, hacks, attacks, and so on. And psychological operations for both attack and defence. Now I have a friend who works for a lobbyist firm, quite a high profile one, does a lot of work with politicians and big corporations, and they got taken off for they flew the whole company out for a big training day, and the training, a couple of days in fact, was about how to apply psychological operations, mass sentiment control to lobbying and PR in the political and corporate space. And so these are techniques you can buy. I should ask at this point, if anybody works for the security services, would you put your hand up? It's just a quintessential test, just to see who looks up there. It's obviously a dead giveaway if you do. Really interesting work from RAND about what strategic information warfare actually looks like. And I think the key point in this is that they ran a series of scenarios, series of exercises, and their finding was this: highlights from the start, fundamental aspect of strategic information warfare, there is no front line. The front line is your kid's bedroom. The front line is your office. The front line is absolutely everywhere. There is no over there anymore because it is everywhere. So some of the characteristics: very low cost of entry. You don't have to be able to buy a tank anymore. You just have to be really good with computers. Blurred boundaries, particularly this one between when you're at war and when you're not at war. This whole fascinating Russian story about the undeclared war. Significantly expanded role for perception management, so actively deceiving large parts of the population. That is a technique, it's a thing we know how to do. We've known how to do it since, certainly the wars. Strategic intelligence challenge, so you no longer trust your own intel because you know that it's capable of being managed in exactly the way that you're doing to other people. There's no threat assessment or tactical warning. If you get a zero-day exploit, somebody comes at you, you have nothing. You have no warning. You're purely in a kind of reactive mode. And then this interior vulnerability, so there is no over there anymore. It's all of the devices that we've all got in this room. It's that thing sat there. And so I thought I'd play a little game this evening of spot the state-sponsored incursion into our national security. And so this is a motherboard of a Supremicro brand video compression server. I'm sure many of you have them in your organisations. There's around 30,000 companies worldwide. Does anybody know where this is going? Hands up if you do. Don't spoil it for the others. You do. You do. Okay. Brilliant. So can you see a state-sponsored incursion into our national security? No? Can you see it now? It's hard to spot, I'll give you that. Perhaps now, is there anything you can see there that looks a bit dodgy, that might be compromising your security? No? Okay. It's kind of getting there now. Can you see anything so far? No? Okay. Can you see it now? It's there. And that is an embedded hardware microchip that does a very simple thing. It issues a call and a response to a remote server. And it's a hardware hack that's been applied to those motherboards for an unknown period of time. Those motherboards are deployed in security-sensitive environments. They're deployed, they were about to be bought in bulk by Apple. I don't think they actually did in the end. But that's hard. Getting a hardware hack into a motherboard through the supply chain and production system, that requires state-level intervention into the supply chain of these things. So you tell me whether we're at war. You tell me whether a state allowing that to happen, enabling that to happen, and then making those motherboards go out into the world in computer applications that are embedded around the planet, is that an act of warfare or not? Similarly, this one, come to sunny Novorossiya. I don't know if anybody's planning a holiday this year, but you can't, sadly, because it doesn't exist, or at least it didn't until 2014. When Vladimir Putin gave a speech and he took the name of a place which had previously existed. It was a place in Russia previously, but hadn't existed for a very, very long time. And he took a part of the Ukraine that he was thinking about in a sort of slightly amorous way that he likes to do about parts of the world. And he redesignated it. He said, that is Novorossiya. So overnight, people found themselves citizens of Novorossiya, a place that they'd never heard of or thought that they lived in before. And the fascinating thing with that is not only does it have a flag, it had a flag almost overnight, it had maps, it has a national anthem. You can go onto Wikipedia and listen to the national anthem of a place that did not exist before he said that it did in a speech. And so this is not just fake news, it's fake reality, it's mass sentiment control and the ability to kind of see that through at a scale which was previously, I think, largely unimaginable. I can recommend, however, the national anthem. It is brilliant. It sounds fantastic. This one is interesting. This was from an article in 2005 about the US intelligence operations in Iraq. And it was about a centre that was based out there. But this point about the 1,200 strong psychological operations unit based at Fort Bragg, brag. Turns out what its officers call, in brackets, truthful messages. You don't need those if it's truthful. That's just a feature. To support the US government's objectives, though its commander acknowledges that these stories are one-sided and their American sponsorship is hidden. So is that good faith? I don't know. It's sentiment control, it's influence management. But I love this, which is why I included it. We call our stuff information and the enemy's propaganda. I thought it was a brilliant definition about whose fake news are we really talking about. Unless we feel left out, of course, we are exceptionally good at some of these things too. So we have the 77th Brigade, we have the 1st Intelligence, Surveillance and Reconnaissance Brigade, hundreds of computer experts being drafted in, the brilliant, frankly, National Cyber Security Centre doing really remarkable work. So are we at war? I don't know. It certainly feels like we're gearing up for something. It certainly feels like if you're creating military combat units that are actively opposing that threat, then there's a question for us. This one is from the Army, from the Army Doctrine publication. We live and fight in a goldfish bowl. There are few secrets any longer. We have access to multiple audiences and they have access to us. No longer is there a clear distinction between war and peace. And just skirting to the end, success is more likely to be achieved through non-military or non-lethal means. And invariably it is the triumph of the narrative that's decisive, not necessarily the facts on the ground. And so who gets to write the story is what counts when it comes to warfare, rather than who wins the battle. So this, I think, it kind of synthesises the problem that we've got. What the government and the public is realising is that while they've evolved from a nuisance, it's a problem, to something that is actually a high-stakes information war, our frameworks for dealing with that are largely where they were 10 years ago. You know, a friend of mine at the BBC is very fond of saying 8 years ago we invented telepathy, and now we desperately wish we hadn't. That actually the capability of knowing what other people think is not necessarily a good thing, as Twitter will attest. We discuss counter-messaging, treating this as a problem of false stories, rather than what it is, an attack on our information ecosystem. So when does it move from being fake news, this kind of, and I have a fundamental view about fake news, or two fundamental views. One is that to an extent all news is fake, because there is no such thing as an objective truth. There's always a subjective element to it, no matter how good your ethics. And so it's not about absolute truth, it's about framing good faith and why you're conveying the information that you are. The other one is about populism, is that there's a box, dusty box in the attic marked populism, and every 10 or 20 years some idiot goes up there and opens it up and then discovers that they can't close it for the next 20 years. And I think it has to see its untrammeled course. Because there is a fascinating, a really interesting book called Alamut, which is a sort of handbook to radicalization, pretends to be from the 11th century, it was written in 1938. But its central message was, if nothing is true, everything is permitted. If there's no frame, if there's no objective truths, if there's nothing you can rely on, then you can go anywhere you like. And so my view is that you have to see out the natural conclusion of populism, which is a bit terrifying, really. So when I was working in museums, we used to talk about target hardening, about making places harder to get into. And so that would include things like fences, barriers, locks, CCTV, and so on. But if we're living in an age with information war where there is no front line, there's no national perimeter or boundary, there's no physical protection measures that are going to stop the incursions into our information. So what do you do when the front line is in your head? When it's your own personal emotional responses? You know, one of the things about social media is that it's social. So what we like to do is click on things for affirmation, share things because it's a social good. We don't actually like to antagonize people, not that you believe it from Twitter, but we actively seek people to agree with us. We don't like getting into confrontation. So when the target of disinformation is your own trust and confidence in civic society, how do you target harden yourself? And I think if we all ask ourselves that question, you know, how good are we at making ourselves less of a threat vector for people who want to abuse information and indeed our democratic process? And I'm not sure. I look at my kids and they're consuming tens of thousands of hours of YouTube videos. One of the things I was terrified to discover the other day is that one of the most popular YouTube videos for kids has never touched human hands. It's algorithmically generated animation with an algorithmically generated plot. And so I am surrendering the moral education of my children to something that's never been near a human. Might not be a bad thing, but These questions that you tend to ask yourself when you're looking at target hardening. The existence of the threat, who's hostile to our organisation and community? In whose interest is it for our way of life to be destabilised? And then you track back from that, this thing about follow the money. Capability, what is their capability to carry out an attack? We know that nations around the world, including our own, are scaling up our ability to manage these systems and to conduct these attacks. What's their history of carrying out similar attacks in the past? Has it worked? What's the intent? Do we know whether they're actively targeting this? And the problem we've got is you don't know in an information war because you don't know whether you're a target vector or not. So the four things you might tend to look at when we're thinking about countering fake news, I think are these. Countermeasures, the best defense is a good offense. If they're going to do it to you, you might as well do it to them first. I understand when it comes to compromising photos and videos of world diplomats, we are something of a world leader. There's then technical solutions, algorithms to the rescue. So I met somebody very interesting. She's a machine learning specialist, a professor, and she's looking at trying programmatically to assess the validity or otherwise of a piece of news or information. And that is a hard problem. That's a non-trivial problem, to find a way of automating the judgment about the veracity of a piece of information. There's regulation. You can say stop doing that, it's illegal, and that's where Martha Lane Fox is at with her responsible tech movement, that you start to introduce regulation for large technology companies. But the one that in my view, which is essentially the thesis of this talk this evening, that is scalable and most likely to succeed, is good old education, education, education. That if you equip the population with the skills they need to limit the efficacy of information war, to handle data responsibly, not to be a vector for fake news and misinformation, you have less of a problem. I love this from the robot Mark Zuckerberg in his congressional hearing when he managed to stare straight ahead for 7 hours at a time. But I think this is really important. You never fully solve security. It's an arms race. So it's not an engineering solution you can get to the end of. It's a constant conversation between your smarts and their smarts, and which of you happens to be smarter on a given day. And so the same person who talked about sending kids naked into a battlefield in information war said this: in a connected age, an ill-informed, ill-educated population, a population lacking in critical skills or discernment, is simply a botnet for malign actors wishing to exploit or influence our democracy. That essentially you have people sat there waiting to be used as a way of transmitting and sharing and exacerbating the problems of fake news and its impact on all of us. So to me, the creation and intentional distribution of strategic propaganda or disinformation is pretty much the best weapon in the information warfare arsenal. It undermines public trust. One of the things that's really interesting is looking at the recent history of sort of Russian-sponsored destabilization of nation-states. There was an election in Austria. There was a sort of extreme candidate, and they didn't win, but they did far better than anybody expected them to, because they had systematic backing from bots and media channels. And so it actually didn't matter that they didn't win, because the fact is it destabilized everyone. It made them doubt the validity of the election process and made them think, is it me? Is it you sat on the train opposite me? Who's making these decisions? And so the effect of destabilizing, polarizing debate, reducing trust fundamentally in the integrity of journalism and the media, which I think is sinful. I think attacking journalism, which is one of the fundamentals of a free democratic society, is just appalling. Eroding confidence in civic institutions and democratic processes. And these fundamentally, as social activity, don't offend people, manage relationships. And what we find is that it's much easier when kind of faced with this onslaught of fake news and misinformation to construct your filter bubble than it is to go head to head with other people. And you look at the polarization around the online debate of some of our recent national decisions, and you realize how quickly people retreat into their respective archipelagos. And then this relatively low self-awareness, so how that social instinct shapes what we post, like, or share. We think we're us, making rational decisions, not influenced by anybody, advertising doesn't work on me. And actually, we are all innately and fundamentally influenced by these things. So, kind of working towards conclusion, I think our role as ethical information professionals is fundamentally about education. It's fundamentally about equipping the civilian population. So encouraging active citizenship, getting people to vote, to engage, to read, to care, to encourage critical thinking, to question and check sources, to promote both literacy in the sense of reading and information literacy in the sense of understanding that information can be good and can be bad, can be shared in good faith and in bad faith, and that those things matter in terms of your decisions. Educating people with the skills to discern the intent behind the information. I'm the son of a school teacher and a journalist, and the one thing I was always told is ask in whose interest is it for that news article to appear in this paper on this day, because it's never what the story's about, it's about who benefits from that being there. We can help design more robust, more ethical services, platforms and institutions. I mean, my answer to Facebook trying programmatically to tackle fake news is they should hire more librarians, because then you have human infrastructure to make rational, ethical decisions about the information you're looking at. Encourage informed regulation. You cannot hammer down on the boundless, permissionless innovation of the internet. You just can't regulate that value away, because that's an unparalleled bounty, but we have to make it an environment we can operate in. Promote our ethics and organise on knowledge so that its source is transparent and auditable. And I think we're all very tired of conversations that end with, can blockchain do that? But there must be ways of ensuring throughout the information workflow that information carries with it the authority and credibility of its source at scale. So I'll finish just by running very briefly. This is the new ethical framework that we recently published. I would say, as information professionals, one of the reasons I want to share this, I'm really interested in whether it has parallels with your ethics as working in data management. I make a commitment to uphold human rights, equalities and diversity and equitable treatment, that we are committed to the public benefit and the advancement of the wider good of our profession, to society, so there's a public good at the heart of what we're trying to do. Preservation and continuity of access to knowledge. You know, the first act of despots and tyrants is to destroy the public record and remove people's sense of their self and continuity of history. Intellectual freedom, including freedom from censorship, so how do you equip people with the tools to take ownership of the information? Impartiality and the avoidance of inappropriate bias. We had many, many meetings about the use of the word inappropriate, by the way. So it heavily implies there's an appropriate bias somewhere in there, and we can absolutely debate that. Confidentiality, and then fundamentally this point about information skills and information literacy. In my view, every school in the country should have a school librarian, and that school librarian should be educating the children and working with the teachers and indeed the parents to gain critical thinking skills, to build critical literacy, to encourage the asking of informed questions, things that were the tenets of philosophy in kind of 5th century Athens, which just need to carry forward into our modern life. We then work to advance our reputation as a profession. We want to be seen as an ethical profession. Information professionals are among the top 5 most trusted professions, and so there must be a reason why. To maintain our currency of our skills, engage with our colleagues and have integrity in the management of information. The organisation makes a commitment to support information professionals through that. So we uphold and defend human rights. We believe that we need to revisit, recode, rethink human rights in a connected age in which data is an economic good, in which your personal data is a tradable asset. And one of the questions we touched on earlier, some public libraries are exploring acting as a data escrow, so you vest your personal data in the library and they trade it on your behalf with services and platforms, and I think that is a model we really ought to be looking at. Equalities and diversity. We are at risk of creating entirely new forms of disenfranchisement and inequality because we didn't have enough before. Good information governance, the value of our work to employers and stakeholders, and so on, freedom from censorship. But the point is that we are now in a connected age. It's not a future channel shift. It's something we have been through and are now living with, and we're just recoding the kind of social mores and professional practices that will enable us to navigate that. So I'll conclude with 2 things, really. I think no connected society is ever fully secure. It's an arms race. So one of the really interesting things talking about security professionals is that it's always about the trade-off between security and privacy. And how you negotiate that as an informed society. But we can each individually choose not to be a vector for fake news and disinformation, so we can pause before we like, post or share. And we can help the public make better informed choices about what they like, post and share and what it means. So I think we can lead the way in educating users about active citizenship in a connected society, and information literacy. And then we can work with government and regulators to inform better regulatory and technical solutions so that we collectively become a much harder target in this information war. So that's everything I had to say. Thank you very much. I have one slide where I was going to tell you about that, but you know about that already because you've already heard about it. But do please come and have a chat with me if you'd like to get hold of a copy. But for the time being, just thank you so much for the opportunity and your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. That was excellent, very thought-provoking. Have you got questions for Nick? Jeff?
I want to come back to the hard target and think of the Novichok attack in Salisbury, recent Turkish embassy debacle.
Yes.
I think it's very clear that the public hasn't believed the stories that have been put out.
No.
Now, that relates to the wisdom of crowds, which I think is something that you're, in a sense, trying to promote. But the wisdom of crowds comes down to very simple things like if you ask a room full of people to guess the weight of a fish or a pot of jam, the mean of these actually comes out to be very close to the real value. And so the question that I think we're asking is, what do we need to do to promote that wisdom of crowds, and how can that be, and to what extent can we continue to rely on it? Because obviously democracy does rely on it. So I haven't asked the question yet.
No, I should get through.
The example that I gave amounts to a single data value, asking people to guess a data value. Now I'm much more interested in the role of what we used to call data models or schemas or ontologies, which are the framework within which you house knowledge. Yes, and it's quite clear that we have implicit, implied ontologies, we have regulated ontologies, and we have other things that might be fake ontologies. And telling the difference between these is much harder than a single data value.
Yes, I completely agree. I mean, I think one of the things that really interests me with ontologies is that I think they're subject to a kind of version of the incompleteness theorem. I think there was a day when you believed that you could throw a kind of ontological girdle around the earth and define all of the possible concepts in an area of discourse, and you just, as our taxonomist friend is shaking your head, you can't do that. And particularly now, if you're dealing with data sets that are diffuse, so they interact with each other, then there is no fixed framework that you're working in, is there? It suddenly becomes a kind of cloud of data points. And so one of the things I'm really interested in is whether you can have data that carries within it the DNA of its creation and its verifiability, because that strikes to me as a much more scalable solution than trying to create a walled garden of trustability around the content. But on the wisdom of crowd things, I mean, I suppose Gladwell's thesis was when they're right, they tend towards right, but when they're wrong, they go all the way over there and are massively and kind of incrementally wrong. And I think that the real issue I've got is the I don't care factor. It's not so much that people, when you tell people that the terrifying one, what was it? It was the Irish election. So there was evidence of Russian state intervention in an Irish election. And there was a video doing the rounds of YouTube which purported to show vote rigging. And it turned out the footage was from actual vote rigging in a Russian election about 30 years earlier. And when quizzed, around a third of the people who were asked, how does that make you feel? Does that bother you? Just said, I don't care. I just don't care. As long as I'm getting services, as long as I'm consuming content, I don't care. And I think the real issue here is that we've got a generation of people who have been taught simply not to care about the security, verifiability of their information. And that really scares me. It's one thing to lose your liberties. It's another not to care about it.
Can I just have a quick, brief rider on that? Which is that I had spent many years running a parish council, which is the lowest form of democracy.
It's the most important. But anyway, yes.
One of the things that came through from that was that, by and large, people are quite happy to let things go as they will until they sense that they really do affect them. And if they feel a sense of threat,
Yes.
they will react very forcibly.
So I've heard the phrase boiling frogs more frequently in the last 2 months than I have at any other stage in my life. There's almost a sense that when it comes to the ecology, people won't care until they're made to care. When it comes to data security, they won't care until it's their personal data that's been infringed and their credit card that's been used. And we have to find some way to make society preemptively care about mass-scale incursions into our democracy. Because otherwise you're out the other side, you're into disrupted society and populism.
Yeah, definitely.
There's an old saying, if you tell a lie long enough, often enough, you believe it yourself. And worse than that, the lie becomes the truth. Nobody knows what the truth is anymore. And the prime example is what's going on now with their Brexit. They've been given so much twisted information that really nobody knows what's happening.
No.
You just go by your instincts.
I mean, it's not a political point at all, but I mean, I wish we had spent more time asking who benefits with Brexit. Fundamentally, whether you're in or out, I'd wish we'd spent more time thinking it costs a lot of money to pay a very, very expensive influencing firm, lobbyist, PR firm, to make a decision go one way or the other. And both sides spent that kind of money. So where did that money come from? Because I think fundamentally you've got an example of a situation where clearly there was intervention at scale on both sides in that decision. And I wish our free press were doing a lot more to find out where that came from. Because it wasn't a natural democratic process in any sense.
I mean, just picking up on your point there about repeat a lie and often and it becomes a truth, and I'd like to test something slightly different out. This is potentially fake news from a while ago. Quick show of hands, how many of you here have heard of the War of 1812? Fair number, right? Typically in schools in the UK, we aren't told that. We aren't told about that. In America, it's a big thing. Why is that? Because it was our naval blockade of America and we lost. So in this case, it's not. Well, the French were involved as well, but yeah. But the point I'm trying to lead to is the fact that that's something where it's not a lie that's been told, it's just we're conveniently not bothered telling the truth about what happened. And so for the Americans, it is a big thing, and we just conveniently aren't told about it. So for us,
burning down the White House as well.
Well, it's that line about, for us it's information, for them it's propaganda.
Yeah.
It's, this is all about perspective. But that is where I think good faith comes in, is if somebody creates spots something on Facebook and they think, oh, that kind of affirms my worldview about this political thing, and they share it on, that's not bad faith. I mean, they're not seeking to disrupt a civilian population. But if you instruct a company and pay them money that have proven techniques to influence lots of people, that's bad faith, and that's acting with malicious intent. And we're not always good at sifting one from the other.
yeah, agreed. Yeah.
Yeah, following on from the point about crowd wisdom and the Khashoggi situation, I don't think there would have been any crowd wisdom on believing that that the Saudis were up to something until it became clear that the Turks had fact in terms of videos and recordings of all sorts in order to battle against it. Otherwise it's just their story and my story.
I think this is interesting though, because none of us know. None of us know. We have no empirical evidence. I haven't seen any forensic. Nobody knows. And so that's why we have the rule of law. And what really worries me is trial by Twitter or trial by social media. That people believe that they know through their interpretation of the facts. And actually, the rule of law served us really, really well for a very long time. And if you go into the rule of opinion, that's a very dangerous road to go down. It destabilises a lot. So, I mean, there is clearly criminality that's gone on there. But it's really interesting how many of us reach very firm conclusions without any kind of investigatory or judicial process. And that is dangerous.
Yeah, Glenn.
When are you doing your TED talk?
That's very kind of you. Thank you. Actually, funny, I know I did one a little while ago about stories from the museum sector. And I mean, one of the interesting things about stories is that they were all based on objects in museums. And they were artefacts. So one was a matchbox, which an Scottish soldier had written a letter to his wife and child, and then he happened to be being deployed to the front, and so he threw it out of the train window as he went past his hometown. Somebody found it and took it to the wife and children, and then he died 3 days later, and that was the last communication they ever had to this, you know, and that's a story. It's verifiable. It's, you know, there's evidence. It's been documented. It's, you know, and so that stuff I think is really important about our national identity, about how you record history and accountability. But that's very kind of you.
Can I have another go?
Go on, then, yeah.
I mean, this isn't a new game, because we've got, you know, we know what happened in Bletchley Park, and we know about George Orwell, and the Ministry of Truth is the one that tells lies, and the Ministry of Defence is the one that wages war, and all the rest of it. So it isn't new at all, but there is a new angle, and I'm particularly worried about AI, because what you're basically saying is that information has to be traceable, just in the same way as food is traceable.
Exactly the same.
So you know you can trust it. But AI-derived information is very untrustworthy, very untraceable. You look at what the neural nets do, and they come up with, you know, an answer to a question or a set of behaviours, and nobody can actually tell you why. The models are not visible.
No.
What we need is an AI that comes up with an ontology that says, this is what I've deduced from the behaviour, and this is what I'm going to behave.
Yes. I mean, but that point about this is not new, it's really interesting. I mean, the great thing with human beings is we tend to figure out how to do a thing and then figure out what it means and what we're going to do with it, what the implications are for our society. And so you look at the invention of movable type and printed word, and what that was used for was the mass spreading of misinformation through kind of religious or quasi-religious pamphlets. And then gradually society caught up and figured out, okay, there's a good way of using this, there's a bad way of using it. I think that's what we're doing now. I think that the thing that really has fundamentally changed is the pace at which new technologies become part of our lives. So somebody described management to me the other day as managing a series of S-curves, and you never get to the end of one innovation cycle before the next one's begun. And so we were just looking at sort of information.
Well, they probably did in the Stone Age.
Well, yeah, but now we haven't got time as a society to catch up. So sitting in the regulation meetings about the responsible tech movement, lawyers are really struggling to take concepts from even just 10 or 15 years ago and apply them to a massively decentralized, distributed kind of data environment with all of these things going on. And so we do have this habit of doing something and figuring out what we're going to do to protect ourselves from it. It's just that's really sped up now, and I think we have to accelerate the pace at which we're dealing with this.
So building on that really in some ways, I think what I'm interested in your thoughts about one of the reasons I think why Twitter is so successful is the immediacy of it. So if you want to find out what's going on, very often Twitter is a very quick and easy way of finding it. But also to find out the true picture, all you're doing is you're seeing fragments of different people's perceptions. Is sometimes that more reflective media, which might be The Economist or something that comes out a week or so later. And so that tension between the immediacy that people want and there's that desire, almost the sugar rush of I've got to have that bit of news now, compared to the more reflective, objective view. What's your view on how things are changing in that?
Well, I think it's fascinating you use the word sugar rush. I think you've got very large industries that have scaled very quickly by using the psychology and physiognomy of addiction to create consumer products, and that's, you know, led to very rapid successes of those products, which is, you know, there's no regulatory basis, but you have at some point to say that's a health threat. So, I mean, coming back to your point about the kind of food analogy, there is a way of looking at this, that it's a public health crisis, and that the two options at how you address that public health crisis are, on the one hand, improve public understanding of the dangers, so you educate people about the risks of bad information as much as you would the risks of bad food or bad wiring. And then you try, in as light a touch way as possible, to regulate the supply chain so that it's verifiable and kind of trustable. And I think that's where we are, is that you've got that whole point about, you know, 8 years ago we invented telepathy and now we wish we hadn't. It's just happened so quickly that I think we have to ask ourselves a question about, is that okay to use tools which fundamentally hinge on addiction and give them to our kids and give them the Wi-Fi passcode, because I'm not sure it is. But that's what
Yes.
And let's
Good,
not
good luck
forget
taking the Wi-Fi off them, by the
Yeah.
way.
it's very hard, because if all your friends are saying, you know, black is white, and you say no, black is not white, then you're the enemy.
Yes.
You know, it's
Yeah.
very, you're not accepted. I've got relations who are connected to the American government, and when they visit us, they're on their phones all the time, and their emotions are thrown all over the place, and they have to know whatever's coming through, whatever the news is, it affects them directly. It's the sugar rush.
Yeah.
And I just think, for Christ's sake, just stop. Put that thing down, just stop, because tomorrow will be different.
Yes.
But that's how they live their lives.
Well, you've got to question the wisdom of using taxpayers' money to put mental health specialists into every school, when it's actually the cause we ought to be targeting, not the effects. And if you look at the social pressure that young people are under now because of this permanent rush of information, and also this, I construct my identity by what I photograph and share, every moment has to be taken from 16 angles so I can get the best duck face. That's a massive amount of pressure to put young people under, and it seems as though we're sort of bolting just closing the stable door after the horse has bolted it.
Well, going back to youngsters and information literacy, how young is too young? When should we start teaching our children? Who's responsible as well? Is it the teachers? Is it schools? Is it parents?
It's got to be mums, dads and teachers, hasn't it? I mean, as the kind of, the carers or whatever the family structure is. I mean, it's got to be a shared effort that says there's a new skill. You wouldn't ideally in the modern world send a kid out illiterate into the world because if they can't read by 11 they never catch up. A third of the present population is functionally illiterate and so on. And so you wouldn't do that to your kids if you care about them. And I think the reality is that this kind of information literacy is a new extension of that skill set. And so you wouldn't send your kids out to the world without that skill set.
But
So
one doesn't speak to the other.
They don't.
They
No.
blame the other for their raising their children. Parents expect teachers to raise children
They
on
do.
their behalf,
But that,
and vice versa.
I mean, I go back to himself from Microsoft saying people wildly overestimate the change that happens in 5 years and wildly underestimate the change that happens in 30. I think we're kind of 10 years into this thing, and so we're starting to target harden through these interactions to understand that information is a thing, it can be dangerous, it can be beneficial, and so it's got to stop being about the device, because the device is the least interesting part of that interaction. It's about the knowledge and the information and the social interactions that are flowing through that device. And so, I mean, the fascinating thing, when you as a parent get frustrated and say, put that thing down and stop doing, whatever it is you're doing, actually you're sort of interrupting something that is equally valid as a social interaction. It's just you don't get it because you didn't grow up in that world. And so I think we have now got a generation that are native to it, that we have to...
Well, my generation is the last actual generation that will ever know pre-internet. That is the forever now. That children will just grow up with the internet and be their babysitter.
Until the pole shift and the electromagnetic pulse kind of kills all the devices. I did hear one magnificently optimistic...
I'll be bombed by those that are defend themselves.
The most optimistic view I've ever heard on Trump was from a librarian. He said, well, if he does nuke the world, then the electromagnetic pulse will knock out all the e-readers so people will go back to books again. So that's pushing it, right? Yes, that's true. That's a very good point.
But actually, it is a point that I think it was in the 1850s. There was a load of solar flares or whatever, and they had issues where the telegraph system at the time, there were sparks flying off all the wires because of the amount of electromagnetics. So if that happened now, we've got so many services reliant on GPS, so everything we do is now based on some form of electricity. We would have a slightly bigger challenge, I think, this time around. And it could happen tomorrow, we don't know, and it might happen. Anyway, on that positive note, I think we'll say one more question, then we'll break for one. Go on, John. Okay, fair enough. So, just like to join me in thanking both Nick and Helen, who actually